It really is an honor and a pleasure to be here at the center this year and also here today. In 1968, Chinese-American restaurateur Violet Wong took her grandson, Gregory Mark, into her basement in Berkeley, California, showed him a canister with 3 reels of 35mm film, and instructed him to, quote, do something with it. The film turned out to be The Curse of Guangun, When the Far East Mingles with the West, a feature film directed by Mark's great-aunt Marian Wong in 1916 and 1917, and starring Marian Wong and her sister-in-law Violet, Gregory Mark's grandmother, which is currently the first known film directed by a Chinese American. Born in San Francisco and raised in Oakland, Marian Evelyn Wong formed the Mandarin Film Company at age 21, financed by money from her brother-in-law. And I'm just going to play some of the silent film while I talk, just to give you a sense of the visuals. According to a 1917 nationally syndicated newspaper article, Wong had, quote, won the distinction of being the first Chinese girl to write and stage a movie. A feature later that year in Moving Picture World describes the film as dealing with, quote, the curse of a Chinese god that follows his people because of the influence of Western civilization. And there's a lot to say actually about this god, Guangun. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Wong finished the film in 1917 and traveled to New York with her mother, who was also in the film right there in the middle. Who also, but they were unable to find a distributor. And so the nitrate negatives and prints lingered in family homes for almost 100 years. The family donated it to the Academy Film Archive in 2004, but only about 35 minutes, about half of the original film was able to be saved. And the surviving fragments bear significant traces of damage. The intertitles have been lost, forcing viewers to guess at the actors' words, and details of the plot and much of the footage is faded, flickering, or marked by scratches or deterioration of the cellulose nitrates emulsion layer. When Violet Wong asked her grandson to do something with her film, her request resonated beyond a discussion of family legacy to connect with larger questions of film history and Asian American history, in particular, these two. How do we recover the lost or obscured histories of marginalized artists whose work has not been cared for by institutions or archives? And what do we do with the partial, damaged, and altered fragments that survive this lack of care? I look at this film using 2 different but overlapping approaches. The first approach draws on research on the filmmaker and her historical, geographical, and cultural context. I look at the public and legal discourses on Chinese Americans in turn of the century US more broadly, and in San Francisco and Oakland more specifically. I look at the political debates within the Chinese American community about changing gender roles, about politics in China, including the 1911 revolution, which is supposedly a central part of the plot of this film. I look at the relationship between what was happening in the film industry in relationship to cultural changes. For example, the rise of the feature film as an attempt to attract a more middle class and female audience. I looked at the kinds of films that Marian Wong would have seen. For example, popular serials like The Perils of Pauline, which featured young women in constant danger who resist their imperilment through athleticism and feminist bravado. Or another popular serial in which this danger is exemplified personified by an evil Asian villain bent on race war. Or films that projected Chinatown as the site of white slavery, opium, gambling, and other forms of vice and violence. Or films that featured Asian women sacrificing themselves for their white lovers, mostly played by white women in yellowface, but occasionally also by Asian actors. I look at the theaters that she would have attended, her professional relationship with Sid Grauman, who owned Grauman's Chinese Theater in Los Angeles. I tried to bring together these various and varied views of Wong's life and times to use as clues for reading the fragments of the film. And again, I'm just going to play a clip just again to give you a sense of the visuals. Caught between the reality of Chinese American communities who are negotiating questions of social integration and political representation, and dominant discourse that still pictured Chinese and Chinese Americans as exotic, foreign, sources of vice and disease, and eternally linked to the past, I see Wong as making an argument in this film for Chinese Americans as modern subjects. But she does so by staging a conflict between old China and new Chinese Americans. The second approach examines the material damage of the surviving fragment of this film, which you can see very clearly in this clip, and reads it within the historical context that I outlined previously. I argue that rather than being an obstacle to our comprehension of the film, its aesthetics function as an indexical and material trace of the larger history of its neglect. The partial, damaged, and contested forms of the film that we have access to stand as a critical analog of what we don't know and why we don't know it. The opening title card of the film contains a double exposure effect in which flames appear to engulf the film's title. Given the state of the film's surviving reels, it is hard not to see a link to the extreme flammability of early film stock that was responsible for the destruction of countless reels of irreplaceable film history. The opening shot of the film serves as a visual reminder of the inherent volatility of the film medium and the incompleteness of its archives. By broadening our view of the filmmaker's life and the film's context of production, for example, the conditions that constructed Chinese Americans as eternal foreigners to the US, we can speculate on some of the conditions that led to its disintegration, why nobody cared for it until somebody did care, and how those changing forms of care shape what this film does and what we do with it. Thank you.